Well, here we are again. The sun rises in the east and sets in the west. And in Australia we have a federal election every 3 years. And most Australians think that this is the time that they can actually choose a government which will determine what happens in the next 3 years. Now, Australia is a federation of states. And it's been a federation of states since 1901, since the end of colonisation, British colonisation. And federal elections have been a feature of the parliamentary system. And as you know, Parliament is divided into two sections: the Senate, which is the House of Review, and the House of Representatives. And when you vote in the federal election, you vote for both houses. Now, people like to think of Australia as a democracy. It's really not a democracy. It's what's called a representative democracy. What that means, every 3 to 4 years, you select a candidate to sit in Parliament on your behalf, and that candidate has a signed blank cheque to make decisions on your behalf for the next 3 years. Irrespective of what they promise, whether they change their political allegiance, there's nothing you can do about it until the next federal election, when you go through the same format. Now, democracy, rule of the people, by the people, for the people, is a different concept. It's comparing representative democracy to democracy is a little bit like comparing an amoeba to a human being. They're dramatically different, although they're both living. Dramatically different. And they're dramatically different because the representative democracy is under a lot of pressure. And in Australia, that pressure basically is dependent on that small section of society that owns the means of production, distribution, exchange and communication. So about 1% of Australians ultimately determine what is the political, social, cultural and environmental agenda in this country. That's a fact. You don't see legislation introduced in Parliament, passed by Parliament, which in the great majority of cases affects their power and wealth. You do see legislation that goes through Parliament which affects your basic freedoms and your economic livelihoods and survival, and you see that consistently. And we see that because in the Australian Constitution we have no constitutional rights, no rights that protect the individual from the arbitrary exercise of state power. So Parliament basically is free, as we've seen during the so-called terrorist phase and now the pandemic phase, to enact laws and pass legislation which strips away any freedoms you may think you have. So how do we continue to have a duopoly in this country, a two-party system? Because in Australia, unlike other parliamentary democracies, we see one or the other of the major parties gain power. And to a significant degree, the way those elections are conducted, who's able to stand, what policies are put forward, what legislation is passed through Parliament, is determined by those weak constitutional arrangements that we have in this country. For example, although we think that anybody has the right to stand for Parliament, the reality is a little bit different. We've recently seen legislation go through Parliament which ensures that only a small minority of people will ever be able to actually stand for Parliament, let alone be elected. And I'll go through that legislation, and then I'll go through past legislation which restricts the ability of individuals, independents and small parties to play any significant role in federal elections. We begin with compulsory voting. Compulsory voting was introduced in Australia in the late 1920s because less than 25% of people actually bothered to cast a ballot at the federal election in the 1920s. This raised concerns regarding the legitimacy of the representatives in Parliament, and most people didn't actually vote because they knew and felt instinctively that it was almost a useless process. So compulsory voting was introduced in order to ensure the turnout was relatively high. And although we have compulsory voting in 2021, still have compulsory voting, although I believe it's a constitutional anomaly, we only have 80 to 85% of people who are actually on the electoral roll and who actually cast a formal ballot. So let's move one step forward. Now, over the last 20 years, we've seen an increase in disillusionment with the major political parties because of their convergence of their policies, and their policies have converged because to a significant degree, in order to be elected in this country where there is the monopoly on both the legacy and social media by a handful of players, the policies you need to elucidate are policies which don't challenge the power of those who exercise power and those who hold wealth in this country. So there's been a convergence of philosophy and a convergence of legislative agenda by both major political parties, which ensure that those who concentrate wealth in their hands and exercise power continue to concentrate wealth and exercise power. And the history of the last 40 years, the history of deregulation, privatisation, globalisation and corporatisation is a history of centralisation of power and wealth in a smaller and smaller minority. But Australians have been a little bit restless, and a number of minor political parties have sprung up, including the Greens, the One Nation, the so-called United Australia Party, to name a few. But in terms of registration, the federal government and the opposition were very concerned about minor parties taking a bigger and bigger slice of the vote. So they've changed the legislation in the last few weeks to ensure that they continue to dominate the political process. For example, up to a few weeks ago, you needed 500 members on the electoral roll to register as a federal political party. Today, that membership criteria has risen to 1,500. Up till a few weeks ago, you could use words like Democratic, Liberal, Labor in your name. The recent legislation means that the parties that have already taken on those words will continue to dominate and use those words, and new political parties will not be able to use words which are fundamentally part and parcel of the language of this country. They've now become the private property of those registered political parties. Then on top of that, you have a number of things that occur which makes it increasingly difficult for people to nominate as independents. And even if they nominate as independents, it becomes extremely difficult to be elected, especially in the Senate. For example, in the Senate, you need $2,000 as a deposit, and you need to get 4% of the vote to get the deposit back in order to stand. If only one candidate stands, your name appears below the line, so people have to mark the appropriate boxes below the line for your vote to count. If, as an independent, you're able to find another running mate, the cost is $4,000. That's just for the privilege of standing. At the same time, although you have a box above the line, it is illegal to have the word independent next to your box. So when you look at a Senate paper, you will see a box with the name of the registered political party, and occasionally you'll see a box with no name next to it, and that's the box of independents. And that has occurred in the Senate because the major political party, the Labor National Liberal duopoly, feel threatened by independent candidates. So if the word independent was placed next to that box, that would alert the voter this is an independent candidate, and they may even vote for them. When it comes to the House of Representatives, your nomination fee is $1,000. The same rules apply. You need 4% of the primary vote in order to get that nomination fee. But you need to have 50 people from your electorate nominate you, who are on the electoral roll, in order for you to be able to stand. And this means that in the process of about 7 to 10 days, you have to run around trying to find 50 people in that electorate. So again, it becomes a little bit difficult, although in the House of Representatives you can have the word independent next to your name. Now these are just little things that are thrown in the pathway of potential representatives, parliamentary representatives, in order to clear the track for the Liberal National Labor duopoly to be re-elected. We also have a preferential system, which means that you'll need to number all the boxes in the House of Representatives, and I think 6 boxes in the Senate. And what that means is, irrespective of who you vote for, ultimately that preference flow will go to one of the major political parties. Occasionally you'll see a Green member elected, occasionally you'll see an independent member elected, but in terms of the House of Representatives, it's basically a two-party affair. Then when you go to the Senate, same process, although smaller parties have an increased chance of being elected in the Senate. As far as the last spot is concerned, there are 6 Senate spots which come up for grabs every federal election, and those senators are in power for 6 years, and the full House of Representatives number 125, I think it's 125, elected every 3 years. So the process itself has become exceptionally difficult. Not only difficult to be elected, but more importantly, difficult to be able to nominate and participate. So to think that representative democracy somehow means democracy is an illusion. Parliamentary democracy is little more than 2 minutes of illusory power. So why was public interest before corporate interest formed if we are aware of the limitations of the parliamentary process and aware of the limitations of ever being elected to an Australian Parliament? Well, we were formed in order to raise ideas and concepts and policies during a federal election campaign. We were also formed so we could be involved in protests, community actions, strikes, occupations, and the list goes on and on. So we were formed to ensure that democracy is not considered to be an exercise of casting a ballot every 3 years, but democracy is also what happens in between elections. The push and shove of everyday social political life. Now, at the next federal election, which will be held before May, possibly most likely in March next year, once the country has opened up from the pandemic and the pandemic issues have been put aside, you will find that once again Australians will, to a significant degree, be forced to go to the polls and be forced to see one of the major political parties take power. The tragedy is that between now and then there are processes in place which will ensure the most conservative and reactionary elements are elected to federal parliament. Not just in terms of the legislative agenda that has been put in place to stop independents and small political parties from participating, but more importantly in terms of policy initiatives. If there's one thing the last federal election taught us, is that policy initiatives that even challenge the power of those who exercise power in a minuscule or minimal effect can be political death in this country. So the next parliamentary campaign will be more of the same. More concentration of power and wealth in fewer and fewer hands. Little action as far as the climate emergency is concerned. No action as far as the growing inequality in this country is concerned. So political parties like public interest before corporate interest, which are not issue-based party, we are not an issue-based party like the Animal Justice Party. We are not an issue-based party like the United Australia Party, which is basically there to ensure that Mr Clive Palmer's mineral resources continue to be exploited by Mr Palmer, because he understands there's increasing pressure on our natural resources actually being used for the good of the whole nation, not just a small minority of billionaires. So the United Australia Party, the party which is bankrolled by Mr Palmer, will be pivotal in terms of the next federal election, as it was the last federal election. And it was the United Australia Party preferences which pushed the Liberal National Party across the line. Not the One Nation's preference, but the United Australia Party, because the United Australia Party ultimately is about Mr Palmer and nothing else. So how does it work? Well, during the federal election, the majority of Australian electorates, over 85 to 90%, will return a sitting member or a new nominee from that political party. So it'll either be a Labor or Liberal. These are non-marginal electorates. What that means is that year in and year out, electors continue to vote for the same people. Somehow thinking that the Labor Party reflects their interests or the Liberal National Party reflects their interest. Then we have marginal electorates. These are the electorates in which the campaign will be won or lost. And we saw during the last federal election the marginal electoral campaign, which was based on pork barrelling, which was based on giving resources to specific electorates in order to try to win those electorate and exercise majority rule in the Senate and House of Representatives. And we will see once again the pork barrelling of marginal electorates, because elections in this country are not won or lost during a federal election campaign. They are won or lost in marginal electorates. And this is where the smaller parties play a pivotal role, because of the preferential system, where irrespective of who you vote for, ultimately, in the majority of marginal electorates, in 95% of them, you will find that your vote will go to one of the major political parties, who will then have the numbers possibly to form government. So the marginal electorate campaign will be one which will be focused on self. It'll be one which will be focused on how much resources and money can be put in the pocket of electors in those marginal electorates in order to coax them over the line. And behind all this, you'll have a media, a legacy media which sets the political, social and cultural agenda during a 24-hour news cycle, and a social media which manipulates that news cycle to suit its alternative facts or its alternative reality, fighting tooth and nail to ensure that conservative and reactionary elements are re-elected. And that's why having independents in running federal elections is important, and that's why it was important that smaller political parties were able to raise issues during election campaigns. Now, public interest before corporate interest will not have 1,500 members by March next year. No way. So hopefully some individuals within the organisation will run as independents. Not that we expect to win any political representation, but in order to raise issues which are exceptionally important, which are becoming more important day by day, raise issues regarding the climate emergency, a response to the climate emergency based on decentralisation, not on centralisation, a response based on community interaction, not massive centralised greenwash energy production systems. Policies regarding public education to ensure that all the money that goes into the private sector from the taxpayer goes back into the public education sector. Money to expand the public health sector, including an emergency centre and emergency centres across the country to deal with pandemics, climate emergency and other natural disasters or unnatural disasters which will or may occur in this country as we progress. It's about public infrastructure, public roads. It's about putting childcare back in the hands of community-based organisations, not private corporations which dominate the childcare industry and have a direct line to the Treasury. It's about bringing aged care back into the hands of the non-profit sector and ensuring that the best aged care as possible. It's about ensuring that we continue to function as a civilisation, not as a disparate number of individuals fighting amongst each other, fighting to get access to the crumbs which are now brushed off the corporate table. It's about talking about putting the natural resources, the wealth from our natural resources back into the country, not into the pockets of corporations who basically are there to satisfy their major shareholders' whims as far as profits is concerned. So there are many, many, many issues you will not hear about during this federal election. Most of them are central to your welfare. You'll hear a lot of garbage, a lot of so-called policies which will change nothing. You will see more and more people excluded from the parliamentary process, and the government hopes that through compulsory voting they will be able to continue to govern and be legitimate in the eyes of the people. But ultimately, we don't have compulsory voting. What we have is a compulsion for you to go to the ballot box and have your name ticked off. There is no compulsion to put a ballot in the ballot box. There is no compulsion to vote formally. What happens to that ballot paper is basically your business and nobody else's business. And although legislation they've tried to pass legislation in Parliament to stop people from advocating people don't vote or vote informal, which is legislation which is currently in place, which has draconian consequences for anybody advocating those two things. The fact is that ultimately, legally, your ultimate responsibility to yourself is to go to the polling booth. What you do, how you vote, whether you vote, how you vote, how you mark that ballot paper is ultimately a private affair, because we still have secret ballots in this country. So think about it. Think about your options during the next federal election. If they want to, for all intentional purpose, ban candidates from standing because they want to maintain that duopoly, then we have to look at other mechanisms via which we can continue to promote political, social and cultural agendas which go against the concept of capitalism, private investment for private profit.